Billionaire CEO humiliated his assistant until he saw her transform and become jealous. What happens when the invisible woman you've ignored for years suddenly becomes impossible to look away from? When the assistant you never truly saw transforms into someone who commands every room she enters. This is a story about power, transformation, and a love that was always there, hidden beneath layers of pride and fear. Stay with me until the end, because what unfolds will challenge everything you think you know about second chances and true recognition. At 26 years old, Rebecca Martinez had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. She arrived at the sleek downtown office tower every morning at 7:20 sir, exactly 10 minutes before official hours began, as if those extra minutes were her silent declaration that her time, her dedication, belonged entirely to the corporation. Her wardrobe consisted of muted tones, an endless rotation of taupe blazers, charcoal slacks, and black cotton blouses that seemed designed to blend into the beige walls of the executive floor. Her dark hair was always pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun, her fragrance non-existent, and her makeup so minimal it might as well have been invisible. This wasn't shyness, it was strategy, a deliberate choice born from experiences that had taught her never to stand out, never to become a distraction, never to give anyone a reason to notice her for anything other than flawless execution. In the cutthroat world of corporate finance, where predictability was valued above personality and efficiency trumped charisma, Rebecca had become the perfect professional, a ghost who never made mistakes, never missed deadlines, never caused problems. For 22 months, she had been the silent mechanism that kept the CEO's world running without friction. Though no one ever acknowledged the countless hours, the sacrificed weekends, the late nights spent anticipating problems before they could even materialize. She was the woman who knew his coffee order better than he did, who could predict his moods based on the set of his jaw, who had memorized his schedule so thoroughly that she could navigate his day with her eyes closed. And yet, despite all of this intimate knowledge, despite being the person who spent more waking hours with him than anyone else in his life, she remained utterly invisible to him. Christopher Bennett, the man to whom Rebecca devoted her considerable talents and tireless energy, was what business magazines like to call a force of nature. At 37, with his precisely tailored Italian suits, his collection of watches that cost more than most people's cars, and the bearing of someone who had never heard the word no, he seemed carved from granite. He didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. A single cool glance from those piercing gray eyes was enough to silence even the most confident executive. He didn't engage in office politics, didn't tolerate small talk, didn't accept excuses or mediocrity. His life was a masterclass in control, every minute scheduled, every interaction calculated, every decision made with surgical precision. This icy demeanor shaped not just his leadership style but his entire worldview, creating an impenetrable barrier between himself and everyone around him. But there was something, one tiny crack in his otherwise flawless armor. When Rebecca smiled at him, really smiled, not the professional courtesy she offered everyone else, but that rare, genuine smile that lit up her entire face, something inside Christopher shifted. In those brief moments, the wall he maintained so carefully would crumble completely. That smile haunted him in ways he would never admit, appearing in his thoughts during board meetings, in the quiet moments before sleep, a weakness he couldn't afford and therefore refused to acknowledge. To Rebecca, however, Christopher saw her as nothing more than a functional component of his perfectly ordered machine, like the expensive espresso maker in his private office, essential but easily replaceable. He depended on her for everything, from orchestrating complex international travel arrangements to managing billion-dollar client relationships, from diffusing potential crises before they reached his desk to remembering the names and preferences of everyone who mattered in his professional orbit. Yet, paradoxically, he never truly looked at her, never saw her as anything more than an extension of his own efficiency. So, whenever their fingers accidentally touched as she handed him documents, whenever she caught him staring and he quickly looked away as if caught in some minor transgression, Rebecca reminded herself that her boss existed on a different plane, unreachable, untouchable, completely beyond her sphere. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Christopher pulled away not from indifference but from fear, from the terrifying realization that if he allowed himself to truly look at her, if he permitted himself to acknowledge what he felt, he would lose the iron control that had defined his entire adult life. Everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, during a meeting that should have been just another routine check-in with the executive team. Rebecca was collecting presentation folders from the conference table when she overheard Christopher's voice carrying from the partially open door to his private office. He was speaking to Daniel, one of the senior partners, and Rebecca froze when she heard her own name. "She's brilliant," Christopher said in that measured, authoritative tone that always made her pulse quicken. Rebecca's heart stuttered, nearly stopping completely. For one impossible moment, the world seemed to slow down, the ambient sounds of the office fading into white noise. The word brilliant echoed in her mind like a symphony, each syllable a revelation, a validation she hadn't realized she desperately needed. But the music stopped abruptly when Daniel's laughter cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. "Are you serious? Brilliant? That plain, completely unremarkable woman? Come on, Christopher. She's about as exciting as beige paint." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face as Christopher's response came after a pause that felt like an eternity. "She's perfect for what I need. I don't require distractions in my workspace." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows, each one landing with precision on the most vulnerable parts of her psyche. Standing frozen several feet away, hidden behind a column in the hallway, she felt tears prick at her eyes, a volatile mixture of humiliation and rage building in her chest. Every word she'd overheard was a brutal reminder that her value was measured not by what she contributed, but by how little she disrupted the status quo, by how successfully she managed to take up no space at all. But Rebecca Martinez had not survived 26 years by allowing herself to crumble at the first sign of adversity. She took a deep, steadying breath, closed her eyes for a count of 5, and when she opened them again, something had shifted. A thought formed in her mind, clear and sharp as crystal. They're going to eat those words, every single one of them. As she walked back to her desk, her spine a little straighter than before, Rebecca felt something new coursing through her veins. It wasn't revenge. That would be too simple, too petty. This was something deeper, something more powerful. It was dignity reclaiming itself, self-worth demanding recognition, a quiet revolution beginning in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She realized in that moment that the wound, painful as it was, could become fuel. Every dismissive comment about her appearance, every casual assumption about her lack of presence, every laugh at her expense would be transformed into motivation. She would make them all choke on their words, not through confrontation or dramatic gestures, but through undeniable results and a presence that could not be ignored. Christopher, absorbed in his conversation, had no idea of the seismic shift his careless words had triggered. To him, it was just another forgettable exchange, another moment that would dissolve into the blur of his highly scheduled days. But Rebecca had learned to read between the lines, to see what people didn't say as clearly as what they did. She would no longer allow herself to be defined by other people's limited perceptions, by their inability to see beyond the surface. And in that moment, as she sat down at her desk and pulled up her calendar, as she methodically began planning not just Christopher's schedule, but her own transformation, something fundamental crystallized within her. I will never be invisible again. The change didn't happen overnight, wasn't the dramatic movie moment where the overlooked woman removes her glasses, lets down her hair, and suddenly everyone sees her. Instead, it was gradual, intimate, almost secret, a process that unfolded in the privacy of her apartment, in the quiet ritual of morning routines, in the simple act of looking at herself in the mirror and refusing to look away. She wasn't trying to impress Christopher or win approval from her colleagues. What she wanted went deeper than that. She wanted to reclaim herself, to rediscover the woman who had learned to hide behind competence and efficiency. Rebecca started keeping a journal, a leather-bound notebook with cream-colored pages where she began writing questions she'd never had the courage to ask herself. Why had she accepted being reduced to a function? Why had she believed that technical perfection was enough? Why had she allowed her professional identity to completely consume her personal one? The pages filled with confessions, with reflections about how her career had devoured her life, leaving behind only a shadow of who she truly was. Slowly, this practice of writing, of forcing herself to confront uncomfortable truths, began reshaping her from the inside out. Her shoulders, which had spent years curved protectively inward, began to straighten. Her eyes, which had always found reasons to look away, started holding the gaze of others. Her voice, still quiet, gained a new quality, becoming clearer, more confident, almost melodic in its newfound certainty. One evening, while reorganizing her closet, Rebecca discovered a dress buried at the back, a deep emerald silk sheath she'd purchased years ago for a special dinner and never worn again. She held it up against her body and felt an echo of the confidence she'd experienced that distant night, a mixture of boldness, freedom, and possibility. Back then, the dress had seemed like a costume, something that didn't match the role she'd cast herself in. Now it felt like a doorway, an invitation to explore who she might become if she stopped erasing herself. Who could I be if I decided to stop disappearing? That question followed her for days, a persistent melody preparing her for what came next. When the company-wide email arrived announcing a corporate retreat at a luxury beach resort, 3 days of team-building activities, informal meetings with senior leadership, and strategic planning sessions, most employees saw it as either a networking opportunity or a chance for a working vacation. For Rebecca, however, it felt like something more significant, almost fateful. 3 days away from the familiar confines of the office, in an environment where the rigid hierarchies might soften just enough to allow for something different, something new. Her first reaction was anxiety. She imagined herself once again as Christopher's silent shadow, carrying files, taking notes, ignored in every conversation, reduced to furniture that happened to be human. But then a different feeling emerged, a spark of defiance, of possibility. Nobody knew about the internal work she'd been doing, the small acts of rebellion she'd been practicing in private. That meant she had the opportunity to arrive at this retreat as a new version of herself, not to seduce anyone or seek revenge, but simply to exist fully, to take up space without apologizing for it. She decided to accept the invitation, confirming her attendance with a decisive click that felt like signing a contract with herself. For the first time in her professional life, the idea of spending 3 days in close proximity to Christopher didn't make her want to shrink into nothing. Instead, it energized her, challenged her, made her pulse quicken with anticipation rather than dread. The night before the trip, Rebecca spread clothes across her bed, looking at the neutral pieces she'd always worn, the beige blouses, the gray slacks, the unremarkable blazers. They all looked faded somehow, insufficient. Next to them lay the emerald dress, a black swimsuit she'd never had the courage to wear outside her apartment, a coral lipstick her best friend had insisted she buy, a cream-colored silk blouse that brought warmth to her skin tone. She hesitated, each piece representing a different version of herself, a different choice about who she wanted to be. After several minutes of internal debate, she took a deep breath and began packing the clothes that represented not who she'd been, but who she was becoming. The elegant dress went in, along with the swimsuit, the silk blouse, linen pants in soft ivory, and the sandals her friend had practically forced her to purchase. As she closed the suitcase, Rebecca realized she wasn't just packing clothes. She was choosing which version of herself to bring to this weekend, and for once, she was choosing the woman who refused to hide. The next morning, boarding the chartered bus to the resort Yaduan, Rebecca noticed the stairs. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, simply worn her hair down in soft waves, put on the ivory linen pants and cream silk blouse, but it was enough to turn heads. A whispered comment from a colleague reached her ears. "Is that really the same person?" She didn't respond, just smiled slightly to herself. For the first time in her career, being noticed didn't trigger shame, but rather a small surge of satisfaction, a quiet validation that she was succeeding in her goal of existing without apology. The bus ride filled with animated conversations among colleagues, and Rebecca, while still reserved, participated more than usual, laughing at jokes, offering observations, letting her voice be heard. It felt like testing a new version of herself in a safe environment, seeing how it felt to engage rather than observe. On the first evening, at the welcome dinner, Rebecca chose the navy dress her friend had helped her select during a rare shopping trip, the fabric draped elegantly, highlighting her figure without being provocative, and the pearl earrings added a touch of sophistication. When she entered the dining hall, she heard a female colleague comment, "I almost didn't recognize you." The words could have been criticism, but Rebecca chose to receive them as a compliment, responding simply with "thank you," her voice steady and confident, no explanation needed, no nervousness showing. It was in that moment that she understood the true power of her transformation. She wasn't trying to become someone else. She was simply allowing the world to see who she'd always been underneath the protective camouflage. Christopher, for his part, seemed oblivious to the metamorphosis, at least initially. He still carried the mental image of his neutral, efficient assistant, that reliable shadow who solved his problems before they materialized. However, something about her posture began to unsettle him. He couldn't quite define what had changed, but he noticed that Rebecca no longer hunched her shoulders quite so much, that her eyes held his gaze for a beat longer than before, that her presence somehow felt more substantial even when she was silent. The change wasn't dramatic enough to name, but for someone as obsessed with control and predictability as Christopher, any deviation from the established pattern triggered his attention. Throughout the dinner, as colleagues toasted and laughed, Rebecca sipped her wine slowly, absorbing the strange sensation of freedom that came from simply existing, without constantly trying to minimize herself. She didn't need to laugh loudly to be noticed, didn't need to explain herself when people looked at her twice. She was just there, fully present, occupying the space that had always belonged to her. And though she didn't realize it yet, her decision to exist without apologizing was already beginning to disturb the established order, because when someone chooses to stop being a shadow, everyone around them is forced to see the difference. In this environment, between muffled laughter and curious glances, something quiet began to build. It wasn't romance yet, wasn't explicit tension, just the seed of a new dynamic taking root. The second day of the retreat dawned with hesitant sunshine reflecting off the mirror-blue surface of the ocean, bringing with it an atmosphere that felt almost cinematic in its perfection. Employees wandered the resort grounds with leisurely steps, as if the beautiful setting had the power to dissolve accumulated stress. Rebecca, however, felt a peculiar tension humming beneath her skin. She'd slept poorly, caught between nervousness and an odd sense of calm, as if she knew instinctively that this day would mark something significant, would become a dividing line in her story. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a black one-piece swimsuit that flattered her figure without being ostentatious, covering it with a white resort robe. As she left her room, she took a deep breath, not to prepare for others' reactions, but to solidify her internal commitment to exist fully, to take up space without asking permission. Rebecca walked to the pool deck with measured steps, each movement carrying the grace of someone who no longer wanted to impress anyone but simply wanted to be seen. Christopher was a few yards away, laughing quietly as he discussed quarterly projections with two major investors. For him, This morning represented another opportunity to cement his image as an unshakable leader, someone who controlled not just the company, but the very atmosphere around him. However, a collective murmur interrupted his sentence, pulling his attention away from the conversation. He turned slowly, certain that nothing could surprise him, and that's when he saw her. Rebecca untying the belt of her robe and with the naturalness of someone performing a simple, unremarkable action, revealing a body that wasn't just physical but symbolic, silent proof of months of dedication, discipline, and above all, courage. Christopher felt as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. It wasn't merely the aesthetic transformation that paralyzed him, it was the brutal contrast with the image he'd always maintained of her, discreet, faded, nearly invisible. Here stood a complete woman, commanding attention without effort, and the revelation left him stunned, almost dizzy. While he remained frozen, Rebecca walked to the pool's edge, dove in with fluid grace, and surfaced with her hair slicked back against her skin, her body moving with the ease of someone who had finally found themselves. She floated on her back, eyes closed, completely at ease, as if the world around her had ceased to exist. She wasn't looking for Christopher, wasn't seeking approval or validation. Her presence was an act of self-affirmation, not provocation, and precisely because of that, the impact on him was devastating. Christopher felt the internal structure that had always sustained him, the certainty that he dominated every space, that he understood every piece on the board, begin to fragment in silence. For the first time in years, he found himself as a spectator rather than the protagonist, watching from the sidelines while someone else commanded the scene. The discomfort grew when he noticed the reactions of others around the pool. An appreciative murmur rippled through the group of executives and employees gathered on the deck. Smiles appeared, heads turned, conversations paused. A young marketing director, not even attempting to hide his interest, moved his lounge chair to get a better view. A female colleague made a comment in a low voice and laughed appreciatively. Christopher felt a strange tightness in his chest, an unfamiliar discomfort that he quickly identified as jealousy. But it went deeper than that. It was fear, a fear he'd never experienced before, as if he'd been expelled from a stage he'd always believed was exclusively his. He, the man who dictated rhythms and controlled narratives, now watched helplessly as someone he'd dismissed assumed center stage with complete naturalness. Later, when Rebecca crossed the deck with tranquil steps, the robe draped casually over her shoulders, she passed directly in front of Christopher without diverting her gaze toward him. There was no arrogance in the gesture, only indifference, and that indifference hurt more than any direct insult could have. Christopher felt small, invisible, irrelevant, a sensation he'd never known. He was accustomed to controlling stories, to being the axis around which everything revolved. Now he found himself reduced to a peripheral detail, and the realization wounded him so acutely that he needed to withdraw, claiming a fictitious meeting just to catch his breath and regain his composure. For the rest of the day, Christopher became a silent observer, keeping his distance but unable to stop watching Rebecca. He saw her laughing with colleagues around the bonfire that evening, noticed the respectful attention she garnered when sharing ideas with other assistants during a casual afternoon workshop, felt a stab of irritation when he observed her engaged in animated debate with the new director of operations, who listened to her as an equal rather than a subordinate. It was evident that Rebecca had gained something beyond physical transformation. She'd found her voice, her confidence, her place in the world. And Christopher, unable to process this shift, felt a confusing mixture of involuntary pride and visceral fear. Pride because somewhere deep inside he recognized that she was part of his team, that her growth reflected well on him in some abstract way. Fear because he no longer had control over her, nor over how others perceived her, nor over his own turbulent reactions to her presence. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any updates. Trust me, what's coming will surprise you. He approached slowly that evening, A glass of champagne balanced between his fingers as he watched Rebecca conversing on the deck, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon reflecting off the sand. For a moment, he almost retreated, not from lack of courage but from fear of breaking something delicate he couldn't even name. Still, he moved forward, interrupting the conversation with a naturalness that only he possessed, and the operations director, sensing there was no room to interpose himself in that commanding presence, withdrew silently, leaving the two of them face to face. Rebecca met his gaze with firmness, her expression challenging, though something flickered in the corners of her eyes that only Christopher could detect. "Do you need something?" she asked, her tone calm, yet masking the electric current that vibrated between them. "I don't recognize you anymore. What's happening?" His voice came out lower than intended, almost a whisper that pulled from her a bitter laugh. "I'm just showing the world that I'm not the invisible, plain, completely unremarkable assistant you always saw me as. Does that bother you?" "It bothers me a lot," he admitted without hesitation, moving slightly closer. "Because I always knew you weren't any of those things." Rebecca raised her chin, a spark of defiance burning in her brown eyes. "Don't give me that line. That's exactly how you've treated me for years." Christopher arched an eyebrow, his gray eyes locked on hers with laser intensity. "How are you so certain?" The question carried a veiled provocation. "I have plenty of reasons." Her response was firm, direct, like a precise strike, and yet her confidence completely disarmed him. "What if you're wrong?" His voice had gone rough now, the distance between them shrinking, the subtle scent of his cologne filling the space. "What if nothing you think is actually true?" An almost imperceptible smile formed on her lips, stubborn and tempting, and she didn't retreat even a centimeter. "I would be very surprised." Christopher took a deep breath, and for an instant, all his impenetrable armor crumbled, revealing the vulnerable man behind the mask. "You're beautiful. You always have been, but your beauty was never what captivated me." The sincerity cut through the air, heavy and unexpected. "I always cared about what you keep here." He brought his hand to his own chest, over his heart, his voice thick with raw emotion. "That's far more beautiful than anything else." Rebecca laughed, provocative but with a tremor in her breath. "You don't care about appearance, but now you can't take your eyes off me. Curious, isn't it?" He ran a hand through his blonde hair, a gesture of frustration mixed with desire, moving so close that the heat from her body reached him. "I never took my eyes off you, Rebecca." "The difference is that now everyone else is looking too, but they're looking the wrong way, like you're a trophy, a piece of meat, and that drives me insane." Her heart raced, unable to control the avalanche of emotions. "What are you trying to say?" Her voice faltered, revealing what she wanted to hide. "Seeing you with other men makes me crazy." The confession emerged like a contained roar, his gray eyes flashing with jealousy. Rebecca arched her eyebrows, incredulous but fascinated, a smile escaping without permission. "You're jealous." Christopher leaned in so close their breaths mingled, their accelerated heartbeats blending in the dense silence. "I'm dying of jealousy," he admitted, his rough voice leaving no room for doubt. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered. She could barely contain her nervous laughter, her heart pounding wildly. "And what are you going to do about it?" she challenged, her voice barely emerging. There was no verbal response. Christopher closed the distance and kissed her, a kiss that began slowly, exploring every inch, every breath, as if he needed to taste what he'd always desired in silence. His hand buried itself in her hair, pulling her with restrained force while the other gripped the deck railing firmly, creating a refuge just for them. Rebecca didn't resist. On the contrary, she surrendered completely, an overwhelming rush that came not from submission but from choice. Each touch was a confession, each movement a promise. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, still so close their foreheads touched, Christopher whispered with a voice choked by the truth he'd always concealed. "Believe me, Rebecca, I always saw you." She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion but firm, imposing her mark even in moments of greatest vulnerability. "Then keep seeing me, always like this." And the challenge in her voice was as sweet as a promise of eternity. For several seconds, they remained just breathing together, gazes locked on each other as if the world had disappeared. The ocean reflected the sunset, tinting his blonde hair gold while Rebecca glowed with an intensity no silence could extinguish. There, in the narrow space between a look and a kiss, something was born that neither pride nor time could stop. A love built not on power, but on recognition and genuine desire. He slid his hand along her neck, feeling the warm skin and the heart pulsing rapidly, as if it beat in rhythm with his own. Each touch carried deep meaning, a wordless confession. "My blood boiled when Daniel said those things because I know you're not just brilliant, you're the reason for my smiles. But I was a coward. I hid my true feelings out of fear. Forgive me." Rebecca entwined her fingers in his blonde hair, pulling him gently closer, as if wanting to engrave this moment in her soul. Around them, the sound of waves mixed with the distant call of evening birds, creating an intimate soundtrack that belonged only to them. Christopher rested one hand on the deck railing and the other on her back, maintaining the closeness without rushing. Both their breathing accelerated, yet there was an electric calm in the air, that paradoxical peace that arises when two worlds finally collide. She pulled back just enough to look at his face, those gray eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "What are you so afraid of?" she asked in a low voice, a soft laugh mixed with provocation. Christopher smiled, and it was a different smile, sweet, genuine, but with the intensity that always disarmed her, of being the only one feeling this, of being rejected. His fingers slid through her hair, down to her shoulders, keeping her close without ever forcing. Rebecca's body responded before her mind could catch up, her heart accelerating, breath shortening, and a bold smile appearing on her lips. "Insecurity doesn't suit you, Christopher," she teased, her tone playful but full of tenderness. He laughed low, his rough voice grazing her skin. "It's true. I've never been like this, but it's all your fault. You'll have to take responsibility." His hand slid down her arm until it reached the nape of her neck, pulling her slightly closer, and he whispered, "I want you the right way." Rebecca arched an eyebrow, amused and curious. "And what would the right way be?" she asked, expectation clear in her voice and in the brightness of her eyes. Christopher didn't answer with words. He moved slowly until their breaths mixed, and kissed her. The kiss began soft, investigative, but soon intensified, becoming deep and urgent, as if all the years of tension had condensed into that single instant. There was no imposition, only mutual choice. When they separated, they just looked at each other, still with their foreheads touching. Christopher murmured, his lips almost brushing hers, "I'll never again allow anyone to see you as a mistake, because I care about you deeply." Rebecca smiled, her breathing labored, eyes glistening with emotion. "I care about you too," she responded firmly, but with the softness of someone who finally felt free. The wind blew gently over the deck, dissipating the last shadow of tension. The ocean reflected the sky tinted with gold and rose, while Christopher interlaced his fingers with hers. It wasn't just desire, it was a silent promise. He was there completely, ready to truly see her, and she, in turn, chose to be seen. The world seemed to disappear, only they existed. The touch, the gaze, and the certainty that this was the beginning of something that didn't need haste but was already blooming, a love built on respect, genuine desire and freedom, side by side, finally free from the past. Saying goodbye that night wasn't easy. Their bodies wanted to stay, to prolong the sensation of being in each other's arms, but reason reminded them they needed rest for the next day. Rebecca walked to her room with her heart racing, carrying in her mind Christopher's scent and the warmth of his gaze, which seemed to undress her soul without any effort. She slept late, dreaming of him, and when dawn broke, she already felt a light anxiety, as if destiny was preparing something even greater for her. The meeting by the ocean was magical. They walked barefoot on the sand, the sun reflecting on the blue sea like a brilliant mirror, waves breaking softly and cradling loose laughter, conversations full of discoveries and confidences that only reinforced how much they were finding each other in every detail. Rebecca laughed hearing stories from Christopher's youth, and he, enchanted, admired her spontaneity, the way she found joy even in the simplest things. It was impossible to deny they were happy in a complete, genuine way, as if the world had finally adjusted to allow these two souls to unite. After spending hours together, they decided to have lunch at a beachfront restaurant. The setting couldn't have been more perfect. Wooden tables under large white umbrellas, the smell of the ocean mixing with fresh seafood, smiling waiters bringing colorful plates and glasses that reflected the golden afternoon light. Christopher ordered white wine, and Rebecca, upon tasting it, couldn't contain her laughter at the way he described each sip, as if he were a professional sommelier. They laughed together, exchanging glances that said much more than any words could express. Each hand touch, each exchanged smile seemed to confirm a truth. They were becoming more enchanted with each passing moment, discovering that happiness could be simple, light, and yet overwhelming. It was as if each minute beside each other filled old gaps, healed silent scars. That entire day together felt like a gift from fate, a rehearsal for a life both desired, though neither had the courage to confess aloud. Time seemed to run too fast, and when night fell, bringing the conference's final event, a gala ball, Rebecca felt her heart pulse differently. She spent an hour getting ready, carefully choosing the dress that best translated the woman she was revealing beside him, strong, confident, passionate. When she descended to the lobby, she found Christopher already waiting. The instant their eyes met was enough for him to lose his breath. For several seconds, Christopher completely forgot where he was, because before him wasn't just the woman who had conquered his mind and heart, but a stunning vision that seemed straight from his most intimate dreams. He approached, his voice low and loaded with emotion, and said, "You look absolutely breathtaking." The simple words were spoken with an intensity that made Rebecca blush, feeling for the first time not just beautiful, but truly seen, truly valued for who she was. Without hesitation, Christopher offered his hand and she accepted. They entered the ballroom hand in hand, drawing curious glances and discreet whispers. The luxurious environment with immense chandeliers, classical music, and elegant guests seemed prepared for this moment. Their presence together side by side radiated something different, a chemistry that couldn't be ignored. During the speeches, while everyone paid attention to the thanks and formalities, Christopher kept Rebecca by his side, his arm brushing hers, their fingers interlaced almost imperceptibly. But at a certain moment, taken by the certainty of his feelings, he decided he no longer wanted to hide anything. He stood up, requested the floor, and when he took the microphone, everyone turned their eyes to him. With a firm voice, he announced not just the event's successes, but revealed before everyone what burned in his chest. "I found here more than partnerships and opportunities. I found love." He looked at Rebecca, whose eyes were already glistening. "This woman changed my life in just a few days, and today I'm not ashamed to say she is my choice, my heart, my future. We're together, and I've never been happier." The ballroom exploded in applause, murmurs, and expressions of surprise. Rebecca brought her hand to her mouth, unable to contain her emotion. Tears flowed freely, and Christopher, approaching her, didn't hesitate. He gently wiped her face with tenderness and then kissed her. It wasn't just any kiss, but a silent declaration, intense, that made everything else disappear. For Rebecca, in that instant, nothing mattered beyond him, beyond the sensation of finally being loved completely, openly, before everyone. The ball began shortly after, and they were the first to take the dance floor. The soft music enveloped them, and they danced pressed together, eyes fixed on each other, as if they were alone in the world. Christopher whispered vows of love, promises of a future together, and Rebecca believed every word because she saw the truth reflected in his gaze. While other couples took turns on the floor, they remained together, as if each turn, each step, was a chapter written just for them. The world could judge them, question them, but nothing would change the intensity of what they felt. It was inevitable. It was overwhelming. The night progressed, but neither seemed willing to separate. When the ball ended, still holding hands, they headed to the elevator. The silence between them was charged with expectation, with contained desire that would finally find release. As soon as the elevator doors closed, Rebecca gathered courage and, without thinking much, pulled Christopher by his tie, pressing her lips to his urgently. The kiss was hungry, burning, full of everything they'd held back until then. When the elevator stopped at Rebecca's floor, she didn't hesitate, pulling him out between kisses and laughter, leading him to her room. The door barely closed behind them when hands were already exploring every inch, bodies seeking each other with haste and intensity. It was as if they could finally become one, without fear, without barriers. Between kisses, laughter, sighs, and broken words, they shed their clothes and their last defenses. Each touch was a confession, each look a silent promise. That night they slept together for the first time, not as two strangers taken by desire, but as two people in love who had found home in each other. The surrender was complete, physical and emotional, and when they finally fell asleep, exhausted and intertwined, there was a certainty in both of them. The love that united them was stronger than any obstacle. Rebecca rested with her head on Christopher's chest, hearing the steady rhythm of his heart, while he wrapped her in his arms like someone protecting their most precious possession. There, in the silence of dawn, they discovered that true love doesn't need much to assert itself. It was enough to be in the right arms. The months passed like a breath, but each day lived beside Christopher felt like an entire chapter, written just for Rebecca. The routine of both, which could have fallen into monotony's trap, actually became a spectacle of complicity. At work, they understood each other with glances, exchanged knowing smiles in meetings that seemed endless to others but had a different shine for them. There were hidden touches under conference tables, stolen kisses in hallways when no one was looking, and messages exchanged in the middle of the afternoon that warmed Rebecca's heart even in the most tense moments. The passion, contrary to what many feared, wasn't a distraction. In reality, it strengthened their partnership, transforming them into an unbeatable duo. The business prospered like never before, and the sensation of victory was even sweeter because each conquest was shared. At the end of each workday, the reward was always the same, ending the night in the same bed, where vows of love mixed with caresses and dreams were divided in silence. When the end of the year arrived, bringing with it positive balances and new opportunities, Christopher's consecration came in the form of public recognition. He was invited to receive an important award at a corporate event that gathered the biggest names in the business elite. Rebecca accompanied him closely, proud, her heart palpitating with emotion, seeing him climb onto the stage impeccably elegant, radiating the confidence that had always enchanted her. The speech began formally, with thanks to colleagues, partners, and collaborators, but suddenly the tone shifted. Christopher took a deep breath, looked directly at Rebecca, and his voice carried an emotion no one expected. Nothing I've achieved would make sense without her. The truth is, I would be nothing and never would have gotten here if it weren't for Rebecca. This award belongs to her too. The audience held its breath, and Rebecca brought her hand to her mouth, moved, while tears threatened to escape. And then, to everyone's surprise, Christopher went even further. Before all of you who represent so much in our careers, I want to make the most important gesture of my life. The entire ballroom fell into absolute silence. He descended from the stage with firm steps, approached Rebecca and knelt before her, pulling from his pocket a small velvet box. The sound of gasps was unanimous. When he opened the box revealing the ring, applause echoed like a wave through the hall. With his eyes fixed on her, Christopher asked, "Will you give me the honor of being my wife and making me the happiest man in the world?" Time seemed to stop. Rebecca, overcome with emotion, could barely contain her tears. She responded only with a nod, before throwing herself into his arms and sealing the answer with a passionate kiss, while everyone applauded standing. The proposal became news, and the following months were a whirlwind of preparations. Rebecca dove into the ceremony details with enthusiasm, while Christopher made sure everything was perfect, always putting her happiness first. When the big day arrived, the church was decorated with white and gold flowers, and the soft sound of violins filled the environment with an almost celestial atmosphere. Rebecca entered in her dream dress, radiant, and all eyes turned to her. But the only one that mattered was Christopher's, standing at the altar, unable to contain his emotion, seeing the woman of his life walking toward him. The vows were the most moving part of the ceremony. Christopher took a deep breath, his hands slightly trembling as he held Rebecca's, and his choked voice revealed more than words. It revealed his soul. "Rebecca," he began, looking directly into her eyes. "I thought I knew what happiness was before you, but I realized I'd never truly been happy. You're the reason for each of my smiles, the source of my strength, and the motive for my most beautiful dreams." He paused, swallowing hard, feeling emotion tighten his throat. "The love I feel for you isn't just passion. It isn't just desire. It's an eternal commitment. I promise to care for you, to respect who you are, to support every step of your journey. I promise to be loyal in each choice and to be by your side, whatever storm may come." His eyes glistened, but his smile didn't fade. "Before everyone here, I say, you are and always will be the great love of my life." Rebecca let tears flow freely without even trying to hide them. She squeezed his hands with tenderness, took a deep breath, and responded with a trembling but firm voice, loaded with emotion. "Christopher, I always believed in love, but I didn't know what it really was until you appeared." She smiled through her tears. "You're my security, the one who makes me feel that nothing can shake me. You're my inspiration, the reason I want to be better each day. And you're also my easy laughter, the peace after a difficult day, the embrace that reminds me I'm not alone." She breathed deeply again, feeling her heart beat irregularly, and continued, "I promise to love you in every detail of our life. I promise to dream with you, to share victories and also the struggling days. I promise to care for you, to respect the man you are, and to choose you every day, again and again until the end." They looked at each other with glistening eyes, and in that instant it seemed no one else existed. Each word had engraved itself, not just in their hearts, but in the hearts of everyone witnessing that union. And when they said yes before the altar, there wasn't a single guest who wasn't moved. The wedding reception was grand, but what remained marked was the sensation of genuine love that spread through the air. Friends and family witnessed the happiness stamped on every gesture, in every exchanged look between them. The first kiss as husband and wife was celebrated with applause and laughter, and the first dance under twinkling lights seemed like a scene from a fairy tale. Christopher didn't let go of Rebecca, as if wanting to record every second of that night in his memory. For them, it was the beginning of a new life. The confirmation that they'd found in each other not just a love partner, but a life partner. The honeymoon was planned for Europe, and each city visited seemed like another scene in the story they were writing together. They walked hand in hand through the narrow streets of Paris, exchanged kisses under the light of the Eiffel Tower, got lost among the canals of Venice, and toasted in Italian vineyards with promises that these would be just the first of many unforgettable moments. Rebecca felt completely alive, as if each trip was the exact translation of an old dream, now lived beside the man she'd chosen to be her eternal companion. Christopher, for his part, never tired of saying there was no landscape in the world more beautiful than her smile. But no memory from the honeymoon, however intense and romantic, surpassed the instant when Rebecca gave the news that would change their lives forever. They were back home when she decided to tell him. She chose a late afternoon with the sun gilding the living room and a tranquil, almost intimate atmosphere. She sat beside him, held his hand, and with a shy smile, let it escape. "Christopher, we're going to have a baby." For an instant, silence reigned. Christopher blinked several times, trying to process the words. Then an immense smile illuminated his face. He stood suddenly, grabbed Rebecca by the waist, and spun her in the air, laughing like a child. "You've given me the greatest gift of my life," he exclaimed, before covering her with kisses, overcome with emotion. Joy took over the house. Christopher couldn't stop caressing Rebecca's still discreet belly, as if he could already feel the life growing there. For him, this was the crowning of everything they'd lived through, the love, the marriage, and now the family they were forming. Rebecca, seeing him so happy, felt even more complete. She knew the future would bring challenges, but looking at Christopher, she was certain they would face everything together. In that tight embrace, in that shared laughter, was proof they'd found not just passion, but true happiness. Their love, which had begun unexpectedly, now transformed into something greater, into a promise of eternity. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself to thank in silence for every step taken until then. Christopher, his heart overflowing, knew his life had changed forever the moment she entered it. And that night, as they fell asleep intertwined, there was a certainty engraved in their souls. The best was still to come. The months of pregnancy brought with them a new rhythm to their lives, a beautiful chaos of doctor's appointments, nursery preparations, and endless conversations about what kind of parents they wanted to be. Christopher became even more protective, almost comically so, insisting Rebecca rest more, eat better, avoid any stress. She found his concern endearing, even when it bordered on excessive, because she could see the pure love and fear behind every worried glance. At work, they made adjustments. Rebecca transitioned some of her responsibilities to other team members, though she remained involved in key projects, unable to completely step back from the career she'd built. Christopher supported her decisions, understanding that her identity wasn't just tied to being his wife or a future mother, but to being herself, the brilliant, capable woman who'd transformed not just his life, but the entire company culture. They spent evenings painting the nursery together, Christopher insisting on doing most of the physical work while Rebecca directed, choosing soft colors and whimsical decorations. They argued playfully over names, laughing at each other's suggestions, creating lists that grew longer each day without ever reaching a final decision. One evening, as Rebecca sat in the rocking chair they'd just assembled, her hand resting on her growing belly, Christopher knelt beside her. He placed his hand over hers, feeling the subtle movements of their child, and his eyes filled with wonder. "I never knew I could feel this much," he whispered. "I spent so many years thinking control was everything, that emotions were weaknesses to be managed. But you taught me that the opposite is true. Feeling everything, being vulnerable, opening yourself completely to another person, that's real strength." Rebecca stroked his hair, her own eyes glistening. "We taught each other," she replied softly. You showed me I didn't have to hide to be safe, that being seen completely could be the greatest gift I give myself. The baby arrived on a crisp autumn morning, earlier than expected but healthy and perfect. Christopher was there for every moment of the labor, holding Rebecca's hand, whispering encouragement, his usual composure completely shattered by the overwhelming experience of witnessing new life entering the world. When the doctor placed their daughter in Rebecca's arms, both parents wept openly, all pretense of control abandoned in the face of something so much larger than themselves. They named her Grace, because that's what she represented, unearned blessing. The grace of love that had found them when neither was looking for it. Parenthood transformed them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Christopher, the man who'd once measured his worth by quarterly earnings and market dominance, found himself reduced to tears by his daughter's first smile. Rebecca, who'd spent years making herself small, discovered a fierceness in motherhood that surprised even her, a willingness to take up space, to demand what her child needed, to model the confidence she wanted Grace to inherit. They were exhausted, overwhelmed, occasionally frustrated, but profoundly happy in a way that felt earned, not given. At the office, things shifted too. Christopher began implementing policies he'd once considered soft: extended parental leave, flexible working arrangements, support for working parents. He'd experienced firsthand how the rigid structures he'd maintained had almost cost him the love of his life, and he was determined not to let that happen to others. Rebecca, returning to work part-time after maternity leave, found herself in a new role, not just as Christopher's assistant but as a strategic advisor, her title and compensation finally reflecting her actual contributions. She no longer organized his schedule. Instead, she shaped company direction, her insights valued in boardrooms where she'd once been invisible. If you've made it this far in the story, I want to thank you for investing your time with us. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the incredible stories we have coming. Your support means everything. The years unfolded with the beautiful messiness of real life. Not the fairy tale perfection of fantasy, but something richer, more textured. They had arguments, of course, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, when Christopher's need for control clashed with Rebecca's hard-won autonomy, when exhaustion made them sharp with each other. But they'd learned to repair, to apologize, to choose each other again, even when it wasn't easy. Grace grew into a curious, confident child who asked endless questions and inherited her father's determination and her mother's empathy. Watching her navigate the world with such fearlessness, Rebecca sometimes felt a pang for her younger self, the woman who'd learned to hide so thoroughly. One evening, when Grace was 5, Christopher found Rebecca in their daughter's room, watching her sleep. He wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. Rebecca leaned into him. "I was thinking about the retreat, about that moment by the pool when I decided to stop hiding. If someone had told me then where I'd be now, I wouldn't have believed them." Christopher turned her to face him, his hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "I believed it," he said. "Maybe not consciously, but some part of me always knew. That's why I was so terrified, because I knew if I let myself really see you, everything would change." "Everything did change," Rebecca replied, smiling. "For the better." Christopher kissed her forehead, then her lips, the gesture containing years of accumulated love. For the better, he agreed. They stood there in the soft glow of the nightlight, two people who'd found each other across the divide of pride and fear, who'd built something real and lasting from the ruins of who they'd pretended to be. Outside, the city hummed with its endless motion, but inside this room, this house, this life they'd created, there was peace. The story of the invisible assistant and the arrogant billionaire had become the story of two whole people who chose to see each other completely, flaws and strengths, fears and hopes. It wasn't always easy. Love never is. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that made all the difference. As Rebecca and Christopher quietly left Grace's room, closing the door with practiced silence, they walked hand in hand to their own bedroom. The house settled into nighttime quiet, and they prepared for sleep with the comfortable choreography of long partnership. But before turning off the lights, Rebecca paused, looking at Christopher in the dimness. "Do you remember what Daniel said that day?" she asked. "The comment that started everything." Christopher's jaw tightened slightly, the memory still capable of producing a flash of anger even after all these years. "How could I forget? I should have confronted him immediately, defended you the way you deserved." Rebecca shook her head. "If you had, maybe I never would have found the motivation to change, to fight for myself, rather than waiting for someone else to fight for me. Sometimes the wounds we receive become the catalyst for our transformation. I'm not grateful for his cruelty, but I'm grateful for what I discovered about myself in response to it." Christopher pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. "You're far more forgiving than I am. If I saw him now, I think I'd still want to punch him." She laughed softly. "My fierce protector. But you know what the best revenge has been? Not proving him wrong about my appearance, though that was satisfying. It's been building this life, becoming someone who doesn't need external validation to know her worth. He's probably still measuring people by their surfaces while I've learned to value depth. That's the real victory." They climbed into bed, and as Rebecca nestled against Christopher's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. The journey from invisible assistant to confident partner, from hidden to seen, from alone to loved, hadn't been simple or straightforward. There had been moments of doubt, setbacks, times when the old insecurities threatened to reclaim her. But she'd persisted, and more importantly, she'd found someone who not only accepted her transformation but celebrated it. Someone who'd done his own work to become worthy of the love she offered. Christopher, feeling her relax into sleep, marveled as he often did at the strange paths life takes. He'd built an empire on the foundation of control, convinced that maintaining distance was the key to success. Then this woman had entered his world, initially just another employee, unremarkable in her determination to remain unremarked. He'd almost missed her entirely, almost let the greatest thing in his life slip past because he was too busy maintaining his carefully constructed walls. The thought of how close he'd come to losing her, of how easily he could have dismissed her permanently, still had the power to make his heart race with retroactive fear. He'd learned that true strength wasn't about domination or control, but about vulnerability, about allowing yourself to be changed by another person, about building something together rather than standing alone at the top. In the darkness, with his wife in his arms and his daughter sleeping down the hall, Christopher understood that this messy, complicated, beautiful life was worth more than all the accolades and achievements his younger self had chased so relentlessly. Success wasn't measured in quarterly reports or market share, but in moments of connection, in the trust of the people you loved, in the legacy you built not through professional accomplishment, but through how you treated others. The transformation that had begun that day at the retreat, when Rebecca emerged from invisibility and he was forced to confront his own blindness, had rippled outward in ways neither could have predicted. At the company, the culture shifted gradually but unmistakably. Other assistants found their voices, felt empowered to contribute ideas rather than just execute orders. Christopher implemented mentorship programs, created pathways for advancement that didn't require self-erasure. He spoke openly in interviews about how his wife had taught him to see people as whole humans rather than functions. And while some critics dismissed it as soft leadership, the results spoke for themselves. Productivity increased, retention improved, and the company became known not just for its financial success, but for its humane approach to business. Rebecca, meanwhile, discovered talents she'd suppressed for years. With Christopher's encouragement and her own growing confidence, she began speaking at conferences, sharing her story of transformation and advocating for workplace cultures that valued diverse voices. She wrote articles about the invisible labor women perform, about the cost of making yourself small, about the revolutionary act of taking up space. Her words resonated with thousands who saw themselves in her story, who'd spent years camouflaging their brilliance to avoid threatening others. She became, almost accidentally, a voice for those who'd learned to silence themselves. Their marriage wasn't perfect. No marriage is, but it was genuine. They still navigated the complexities of two strong personalities, of balancing professional ambitions with family responsibilities, of maintaining their connection amid the chaos of daily life. Some days were harder than others. There were arguments about division of labor, disagreements about parenting strategies, moments when work stress bled into home life. But they'd established a foundation of respect and communication that allowed them to weather these storms. They went to therapy, not because the relationship was failing, but because they wanted to maintain its health, to address small issues before they became large ones. They prioritized date nights, carved out time for just the two of them amid the demands of career and parenthood. As Grace grew older, they were intentional about the lessons they taught her, not just through words but through modeling. She saw her father doing dishes, changing diapers, attending school events, demonstrating that caregiving wasn't gendered. She saw her mother negotiating contracts, leading meetings, commanding rooms, learning that women's voices deserved to be heard. She grew up in a household where both parents worked and both parents nurtured, where power was shared rather than hoarded, where love was expressed through actions as much as words. When Grace was 7, she came home from school upset because a boy had told her she couldn't play soccer because it was a boys' game. Rebecca knelt down to her daughter's level, wiping away tears. "What did you do?" she asked gently. Grace sniffled. "I told him that was stupid and played anyway, but it made me feel bad that he said it." Christopher, overhearing, joined them. "Feeling bad makes sense," he said. "When someone tries to make you small, it hurts. But you know what matters more than his words, your response. You didn't let him define what you could do. You trusted yourself more than you trusted his limitations." Rebecca added, "There will always be people who try to put you in a box, who tell you what you can't be or do. Your dad and I both had to learn not to believe them. Sometimes the people saying those things have power, like a boss or a teacher. That makes it harder, but not impossible to resist. You get to decide who you are, Grace. Nobody else gets that power unless you give it to them." Grace processed this, her young face serious. "Is that why you used to dress boring at work, Mom? Because someone made you feel like you had to?" Rebecca exchanged a glance with Christopher, surprised by her daughter's perceptiveness. "Yes, sweetheart. I thought if I made myself invisible, I'd be safe and valued for my work. But I learned that hiding myself didn't actually protect me. It just made me disappear. And I deserve to be seen, all of me, not just the parts that were convenient for other people." Grace hugged her mother tightly. "I'm glad you stopped hiding. You're so pretty and smart, and you should let everyone see that." Christopher's eyes misted as he watched his daughter embrace his wife, struck by the profound simplicity of childish wisdom. This was why it all mattered. The struggle, the transformation, the hard work of building an equitable partnership. They were breaking cycles, creating new patterns, raising a daughter who wouldn't have to learn painfully in her 20s what no one had taught her in childhood. That night, after Grace was asleep, Rebecca reflected on the conversation. "It's strange," she said to Christopher as they prepared for bed. "I spent so many years invisible, and I thought I was doing it for professional reasons, to be taken seriously, to succeed in a male-dominated environment. But really, I think I was just scared. Scared of being seen and judged, scared of taking up space, scared of being too much or not enough. The invisibility felt safer than the vulnerability of being fully present." Christopher nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that more than you might think. My armor looked different than yours. The cold CEO persona, the emotional distance, the obsession with control. But it served the same purpose. Protection. If I didn't let anyone close, they couldn't hurt me or distract me, or make me question the narrow definition of success I'd built my identity around. We were both hiding, just in different ways. Rebecca turned to face him fully. What changed for you? I know what shifted for me. It was overhearing that conversation, feeling the sting of being dismissed, deciding I was worth more. But you, when did you start wanting something different? Christopher was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think it was gradual, he finally said. There were these moments with you, before the retreat, before anything changed visibly. Times when you'd solve an impossible problem or anticipate something I needed before I knew I needed it, and I'd feel this flash of something. Admiration, attraction, I don't know. But I'd push it down immediately, tell myself you were just an assistant, that those feelings were inappropriate or inconvenient. The control I prided myself on was really just fear of feeling too much. He paused, his hand finding hers. Then at the retreat, when I saw you by the pool, when I watched other men notice you and realized I'd been lying to myself for years, everything I'd been suppressing just erupted. The jealousy was intense, but underneath it was this terrifying recognition that I'd almost missed you, that I'd been so determined to maintain my carefully ordered world that I'd nearly let the most important person in it remain invisible to me. That was my breaking point, realizing how close I'd come to losing something I didn't even know I had. They held each other in the quiet darkness, two people who'd found their way through fear and pride to something authentic. The years continued their march forward, bringing new challenges and joys. Christopher's company expanded internationally, requiring more travel, more time away from home. They navigated this new phase with the same intentional communication that had become their hallmark, discussing expectations, scheduling quality time, using technology to stay connected across time zones. Rebecca's advocacy work grew as well, and she was invited to serve on corporate boards, to advise companies on inclusive practices, to speak at major conferences. She balanced these opportunities with her family commitments, sometimes bringing Grace along to events, showing her daughter what it looked like when women led. There were sacrifices on both sides. Christopher turned down opportunities that would have required relocation, prioritizing family stability over professional advancement in ways his younger self never would have considered. Rebecca said no to projects that would have demanded too much time away, recognizing that she wanted to be present for Grace's childhood, not just successful in the abstract. They made these choices consciously, together, redefining what success meant for their family. When Grace turned 10, she asked if she could see where her parents worked. They arranged a day where she could visit the office, and watching their daughter walk through the halls that had been the setting for so much of their story felt surreal. Grace sat in the conference room where Rebecca had once been invisible, where she'd overheard the words that sparked her transformation, and asked questions about the business with genuine curiosity. She watched her mother lead a meeting with quiet authority, saw the respect in the room, the way people listened when Rebecca spoke. Afterward, Grace declared she wanted to be just like her mom when she grew up. Rebecca felt a complex mix of pride and protectiveness. "You can be anything you want," she told Grace. "You don't have to follow my path. The important thing is that you follow your own interests, develop your own voice, become whoever feels true to you." Christopher added, "And remember that whoever you become, whatever you choose to do, your worth isn't determined by your job or your achievements or what other people think of you. Your worth is inherent." Mom and I both had to learn that the hard way. We want you to know it from the start. As the years progressed, Rebecca and Christopher watched with bittersweet pride as Grace grew more independent, developing her own personality, interests, and opinions. She was fearless in ways that amazed them, speaking up in class, trying new activities without the self-consciousness that had plagued Rebecca at the same age, confidently asserting her needs and boundaries. They saw in her the fruit of their own hard-won growth, a child raised by parents who'd learned to value authenticity over performance, connection over control. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Christopher planned a return to the resort where everything had changed. They left Grace with Rebecca's parents and flew to the coastal paradise that held so many memories. Walking through the grounds, revisiting the pool where Rebecca had made her declaration of visibility, sitting on the deck where they'd first kissed, felt like traveling through time. So much had changed, yet the fundamental connection between them remained. That evening, dressed for dinner, they stood on the same deck where a decade earlier Christopher had confessed his jealousy and fear. The ocean spread before them, infinite and unchanging, a witness to their transformation. Rebecca leaned against the railing, the warm breeze lifting her hair, and Christopher moved beside her, his hand covering hers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The way everything unfolded, all the difficulty." Rebecca turned to him, her expression soft. "Not for a second. Every hard moment, every struggle, every time I had to fight to be seen or heard or valued, it was worth it, because it led here, to this life, to you, to Grace, to becoming someone I'm proud to be." She paused, then smiled. "Though I will say I'm grateful I don't have to plan your schedule anymore." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I don't miss treating you like an assistant. Having you as a partner, in every sense, is infinitely better. Though I have to admit, you were terrifyingly efficient." "I was efficient because I was trying to be indispensable," Rebecca admitted. "I thought if I was perfect enough at my job, I'd be valued, even if I wasn't seen. It took me way too long to realize those are different things." Christopher pulled her close. "I see you," he murmured against her hair. "I've been seeing you, really seeing you, since that day you emerged from the water looking like you'd conquered the world, and I fall in love with you more deeply every day, not despite how you've grown, but because of it. Every time you challenge me, every time you stand firm in who you are, every time you refuse to diminish yourself for anyone's comfort, including mine, I love you more." She tilted her face up to his, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "I see you too, all of you. Not just the powerful CEO, but the man who reads bedtime stories with funny voices, who cries at sentimental movies, who supports my dreams even when they complicate your life. You transformed too, Christopher. You let go of control and found connection instead. That took courage." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Two people who'd journeyed from invisibility and isolation to a love that was seen, celebrated, and deeply real. The vacation was a chance to reconnect away from the demands of daily life, to remember why they'd chosen each other before the roles of parents and professionals had layered over the foundation of their relationship. They talked for hours, made love with the leisure of people who had time, laughed at private jokes accumulated over years of shared life. On the last evening, as they prepared to return home to their daughter and their responsibilities, Rebecca felt profoundly grateful, not just for Christopher, though she loved him beyond measure, but for herself, for the woman she'd become, for the journey she'd traveled from invisible to undeniable. Back home, life resumed its familiar rhythm, but something had shifted during those days away. They returned refreshed, recommitted to each other and to the family they were building. Grace, thrilled to have them back, chattered about her time with her grandparents, oblivious to the deeper work her parents had been doing, the tending of a relationship that made her secure world possible. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own challenges and joys, birthdays and holidays, professional triumphs and setbacks, the ordinary magic of a life well lived. They watched Grace navigate middle school with the resilience they'd tried to instill, saw her defend a friend from bullying, saw her question unfair rules, saw her becoming her own person. They celebrated anniversaries, marking not just time passed but growth achieved, obstacles overcome, love deepened through conscious choice. Rebecca's career continued to evolve, and she eventually left the company to start her own consulting firm, specializing in organizational culture and leadership development. It was terrifying to step away from the security of her position, but Christopher encouraged her, just as she'd supported his risks over the years. The firm grew steadily, built on her reputation and insights, providing her with a sense of accomplishment that was entirely her own, not reflected glory from being Christopher's wife, but genuine recognition of her expertise. Christopher, for his part, began to step back slightly from day-to-day operations, bringing in a co-CEO and transitioning to a more strategic role. He wanted more time with his family, wanted to watch Grace's high school years unfold, wanted to travel with Rebecca before they got too old to enjoy it. The shift wasn't easy for someone who'd defined himself by work for so long, but he'd learned that identity could be more expansive, that he could be more than his professional achievements. When Grace was 16, she asked her mother about the story she'd heard in fragments over the years, the story of how her parents had gotten together. Rebecca hesitated, unsure how much to share with her daughter, but decided honesty was more valuable than a sanitized version. She told Grace about being invisible, about overhearing the dismissive comments, about deciding to transform not for anyone else but for herself. She explained how sometimes love arrives in unexpected ways, how the person you're meant to be with might be right in front of you even when you can't see it yet. Grace listened intently, processing. So Dad didn't notice you at first because you were trying not to be noticed. That's kind of sad, Mom. Rebecca nodded. It was sad. I wasted a lot of time believing I had to hide to be safe. But I also learned something important through that experience. Your value doesn't depend on other people seeing it. You have worth whether anyone acknowledges it or not. The key is making sure you see it yourself. Grace considered this. But Dad did see you eventually, right? He just didn't know how to handle it. Christopher, who'd been listening from the doorway, entered the room. I saw your mother from the beginning, he said. I just was too afraid to admit what I saw. Too committed to keeping my life controlled and compartmentalized. When she refused to stay invisible anymore, I couldn't avoid the truth. I was in love with her, and I'd been in love with her for longer than I'd admitted to myself. Grace looked between her parents, her teenage wisdom cutting through complexity. So basically, you both had to stop being scared before you could be together. They exchanged glances, smiling at how their daughter had distilled years of struggle into a single sentence. Yes, Rebecca said. That's exactly it. Grace nodded, satisfied. Good. I'm glad you figured it out. Otherwise I wouldn't exist, and that would be terrible. She grinned, the moment of seriousness breaking into teenage humor, and left the room, leaving her parents alone. Christopher moved to Rebecca, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. She's right, you know. The best thing I ever did was get over my fear and choose you. Rebecca leaned back against him, comfortable in his embrace. We chose each other. That's what makes it work. It's not just passion or attraction or even love in the abstract. It's the daily choice to see each other, to value each other, to keep choosing us even when it's hard. As they stood there, looking out at the life they'd built, the home they'd made, the daughter they'd raised, Rebecca felt a sense of completion. Not because the story was over. Life doesn't work that way. There would be more chapters, more challenges, more growth required. But because she'd arrived at a place she'd once thought impossible, she was seen, she was valued, she was loved for exactly who she was, and perhaps more importantly, she saw herself clearly, without the distortions of fear or the need to hide. Christopher rested his chin on her shoulder. "Thank you," he murmured. "For refusing to stay invisible, for insisting I see you, for transforming my life into something I didn't even know I wanted. I was so lost before you, and I didn't even know it." Rebecca turned in his arms, her hands cupping his face. Thank you for being brave enough to change, for letting go of control, for becoming a partner instead of just a boss. We saved each other in a way. They kissed, the gesture containing a decade of shared history, of struggles overcome, of love tested and proven. The sun was setting outside, casting golden light through the windows, and somewhere in the house, Grace was playing music, the sound of her young voice filling the spaces they'd created together. This was their story, not perfect but real, not always easy but genuine, not a fairy tale but something better, a life built on mutual respect, continuous growth, and the revolutionary act of seeing and being seen. And as they stood in their home, in the life they'd consciously built together, they knew with certainty that this messy, beautiful, complicated life was more than either had dared to dream. So tell me, did you enjoy this story? If you did, I'd love for you to explore the channel and watch the other videos I've prepared with so much care. Now, on a scale of 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story? I really want to know your opinion. Thank you so much for everything. May blessings find you and your family, and I'll see you in the next story.